The second issue is globalization. The fact that that a variety of factors, liberalization of trade and investment policies, these information communications technologies seem to increase in the pace of the development, have increased the flow of capital, goods, services throughout the world, actually integrating together not only our economies, but our culture and our people. A couple of years ago, the National Intelligence Council, which is the collection of the various intelligence agencies in the United States, did a study on what they expected in the year 2020. And they suggested the very magnitude and speed of change resulting from a globalizing world would be the defining feature of the world for the next decade or more. During that time, China's gross national product will exceed that of all other Western economic powers other than the United States. And India and Brazil would likely surpass in economic strength all of the European nations. Globalization would be the defining force shaping all other major trends in the world of 2020. Friedman himself notes in his book, The World is Flat, that this information and communications technology have allowed 3 billion people who were excluded from the pre-internet economy to walk out on the level playing field, hence the title of his book, from countries like China, India, Russia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Central Asia. And it's the convergence of new players on a new playing field, developing new process for horizontal collaboration that he believes is the most important force shaping global economics and politics in the 21st century. Now, you've probably heard with your other speakers that some people would contend that rather than the world becoming flatter, it's becoming more peaked because economic activity is centered around places where human talent concentrates. One of my colleagues at Michigan, C.K. Pralahad, flips this over and suggests that the internet, modern communications technology, is enabling the participation of billions of people at the bottom of the economic pyramid that in the past were essentially separated away from economic prosperity and allowing them to participate through microeconomic transactions. But regardless of where you are, from Dublin to Prague, from Bangalore to Shanghai, I think there's growing awareness throughout the world that economic prosperity and social well-being requires a public investment in knowledge resources. And that's in the education of workforce, that's in the generation of new knowledge, innovation, and so forth. So that's the second theme. Third theme, demographics. It's interesting today that over half of the people in the world live in countries with aging populations. In North America, in Europe, in much of Asia, the baby boomers are approaching retirement. That's folks like me. In this country, there are already more people over the age of 65 than there are teenagers, and that situation will continue for decades to come. In fact, over the next decade, the percentage of population over the age of 60 in the United States, Europe, and Asia will grow from 30 to 40%. In much of the world, the European Union, for example, and particularly in countries like Japan, the fertility rate has now dropped below replacement value. In Japan, it's 1.2, in Europe, it's 1.4, and of course, replacement rate would be about 2.1 children on the average per woman. So that means that these populations without migration will actually begin to shrink. And in Eastern Europe, you're actually already seeing populations decline because of the low birth rate and because of the outmigration of East Europeans into Western Europe looking for employment. The contrast here is that in the rest of the world, the young have taken over. It's estimated there are over 2 billion teenagers in the world today. The average age is less than 20. And the reason why this is important to developed nations is that this creates an enormous need, an appetite and desire for education, because these young people also realize that their future in the knowledge economy depends on their education. The former president of the British Open University several years ago suggested that at that time, which would be the turn of the century, there were 30 million people in the world ready for a college education without any place to go. The conference we had in Switzerland in June upped the ante, noting that over the next decade, there will be 250 million citizens of the world ready for universities without those opportunities. To meet that, it would require building a university the size of Iowa State or the University of Michigan every week for the next decade. This is driving enormous disparities in wealth and economic opportunity, which in turn is driving population migration. And while much of the developed world is aging, with populations reaching a stable point and perhaps declining, the United States is in a somewhat different situation because immigration has taken hold in the United States, particularly from Latin America. In fact, over the last decade, immigration from Latin America and Asia contributed 53% of the growth of the American population. So unlike Europe and developed countries in Asia, such as Japan, we will continue to see population growth beyond our current level of about 300 million to perhaps as many as 450 million by the year 2050. That's important because population in a world dependent upon human capital, if leveraged correctly, will provide the opportunity for economic growth. The difficulty, though, for our society is that population will be primarily groups which in the past generally have not been empowered with full participation in the life of the nation, meaning women, immigrants, people from underrepresented minority groups. In fact, by the year 2040, it's estimated that this country will no longer have a dominant or majority ethnic group. And we've already seen that situation in several states, including California, New Mexico, Arizona, and most recently Texas. And that will characterize the entire country. So knowledge, globalization, demographics, what's next? Well, the field that I'm most familiar with is technological change. My background is in kind of big technology. In fact, I was a nuclear engineer by training, and that's coming back as evidenced by the fact that the textbook I wrote in 1976 and have not touched since that time is beginning to sell again. But this is a technology, as are most energy technologies, which change over time scales of typically decades for the new technology, and to replace the infrastructure requires about a generation. The technologies driving change in our world today operate at the microscopic level: information technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology. These technologies evolve exponentially. We sometimes refer to that as Moore's law, that the number of elements you can put on a silicon chip for a given price increase double in amount roughly every 18 months. But everything about these technologies, bandwidth, the microscopic size and so forth, tend to evolve on a doubling time of typically about a year. What that means is that the technology we have today will be from 100 to 1,000 times more powerful a decade from now, perhaps 1,000,000 times more powerful in 2 decades, 1,000,000,000 in 3 decades, and so forth. That's exponential growth. What we have on our desktops as giga technology is evolving to tera technology. In fact, the disks in my desktop computer are a terabyte of information. To peta technology, to exa technology, that's a billion. For planning purposes, as you look at what that technology can do, you can pretty much figure that on the time scale of decades, we will have available infinite bandwidth, infinite processing power, and infinite storage. You can forget about erasing your memory. You won't have to, okay? At least compared to what we have today. We'll evolve from e-commerce and e-government and e-learning to e-everything, because this technology will be the principal interface not simply between people and their environment, but between people and one another. It'll pull together groups. As I mentioned earlier, the buzzword for this is cyber infrastructure, much like the interstate highway system was the infrastructure for the transportation age. Arden Bement, director of the National Science Foundation, earlier this year put it this way: we're entering a second revolution in information technology, and one that may well usher in a new technological age that will dwarf in sheer transmissional scope and power anything we've yet experienced in the current